I'm Guy Brewer, and I really am delighted to welcome you to this presentation of Hope for Humanity. Tonight, we invite you to open a window of your soul, that is, your imagination, and join us in a ministry of hope to displaced persons stuck at the southern border of the United States. At first blush, it would be quite natural to ask yourself, how could I possibly help all of these people? The needs seem so overwhelming. There are thousands of people living in makeshift camps where they've been waiting for months, some for years, to be granted asylum in the US. So in answer to your question, what can I possibly do? Hope for Humanity invites you to join us in believing that there are no hopeless cases where God is concerned. God knows the suffering of these desperate people and wants us to be their neighbors. Imagine that their neighborhood is our neighborhood. Yes, they need us, but we need them too. These refugees demonstrate every day what it means to be human. They live in desperate conditions, terrible conditions, but they do not give up. They show strength and courage that many only wish they had. And God is poised to deliver these folks from their suffering. At Hope for Humanity, we believe with all our hearts, the old saying is true. When we are down to nothing, God is up to something. We're so glad you've joined us in this journey of hope. As you imagine these displaced persons as your neighbors, consider the kind of neighborhood we can build with them. Join us now in reflecting on this prayer poem entitled, "Won't You Be My Neighbor?" It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Won't you be mine? Won't you be kind? It's a horrible day in their neighborhood. They live in refugee camps filled with fear, filth, violence, and their desperate cry, "Won't you be my neighbor?" Many people pass by, pretending not to hear them, looking the other way, ignoring their pain, because these dirty foreigners are not my problem, and they are not my neighbors. Who does God say is my neighbor? The neighbor is one whose needs I see, whose crying I hear, whose tears I share. It doesn't matter whether they live next door or in a refugee camp. Where people are rejected and hurting, God is there and is asking us, "Won't you be my neighbor?"
Hi there. Hope for Humanity greets you with open arms and open hearts. We didn't know it, but our GPS, that is, our God positioning system, led us to that coffee shop on a July morning. Over cups of coffee with cream and a side order of compassion, conversation among three ordinary women became a commission from God. The target of our mutual calling to Hope for Humanity ministry was thousands of miles away in Matamoros, Mexico. In that town, just the other side of the US border wall, thousands of displaced persons languish as they hope against all odds to find a new life in America. Their suffering is indescribable. Without shelter, they team together in makeshift camps under tents, waiting for hope of any sort of good news, and just trying to survive another day of unbelievable seasonal changes and violent cartels. But the good news is that God hears the cries of his suffering people, these people without a country or a home. To our amazement, God spoke to our hearts in that cozy coffee shop thousands of miles away. He said, "Go. I am sending you to help my people, and I will be with you." That time in Matamoros changed us. Our hearts were broken for these children of God our own country was treating as less than human. You might say, we fell in love with the unlovable, and we felt compelled to tell their story and the story of hope for humanity and God's calling to bring justice to the migrant people. In church and after church, people have gathered to hear about hope for humanity and the plight of people stuck at the southern border. Sharing their story has been a great start, but it's only the barest beginning. Despite the challenges the COVID pandemic has brought to our fledgling ministry, God continues to open doors for our work of advocacy, education, and pilgrimage. Like the world, much of our current ministry is virtual, and yet we are unhindered and undaunted. God continues to stoke the fires of our prophetic mission to courageously tell the truth, creatively inspire hope, and call the church to be a community of compassion for all people. In just a few minutes, you will listen to a poem, Refugees by Brian Bilston. The reading will be followed by 2 minutes of silent reflection, which will end with a chime. During this time of silence, please ask yourself these questions. What preconceived assumptions do you have about refugees and immigrants? What would the God you know say about the plight of refugees in our country? How did you feel when you learned of the separation of families at the border? During silence, these questions will be posted in the chat for your review. Refugees by Brian Bilston.
Refugees, they have no need of our help. So do not tell me these haggard faces could belong to you or me should life have dealt a different hand. We need to see them for who they really are. Chancers and scroungers, layabouts and loungers, with the bombs up their sleeves, cutthroats and thieves. They are not welcome here. We should make them go back to where they came from. They cannot share our food, share our homes, share our countries. Instead, let us build a wall to keep them out. It is not okay to say these people are just like us. A place should only belong to those who were born there. Do not be so stupid to think that the world can be looked at another way.
The world can be looked at another way. Do not be so stupid to think that a place should only belong to those who are born there. These are people just like us. It is okay to say, build a wall to keep them out. It is not okay. Instead, let us share our countries, share our homes, share our food. They cannot go back to where they came from. We should make them welcome here. They are not cutthroats and thieves with bombs up their sleeves, layabouts and loungers, chancers and scroungers. We need to see them for who they really are. Should life have dealt a different hand, these haggard faces could belong to you or me. So do not tell me they have no need of our help. Refugees by Brian Bilston.
I know many of you were anticipating hearing Deaconess Cindy Johnson speak tonight. I'm sorry to say that due to a family illness, Cindy will not be able to be with us tonight. We will be rescheduling her for another time, so you will definitely have that opportunity to hear her at a later date. In Cindy's absence, Hope for Humanity is very happy to have Jenifer Wolf Williams, who agreed to be our speaker, I might say, on very short notice. We are so grateful for Jenifer giving her time, and we look forward to hearing her. Jenifer Wolf Williams is the Executive Director of Humanitarian Outreach for Migrant Emotional Health, also referred to as H.O.M.E, H-O-M-E. Asylum seekers who arrive at the U.S. southern border are in flight for their lives, but rarely have evidence of their trauma to present to U.S. officials. H.O.M.E provides detailed mental health assessments to meet this need, and there is no charge for this service. H.O.M.E does the same type of Hope Home does the same for all types of humanitarian immigration by partnering with nonprofit and pro bono attorneys to support those who seek safety in the U.S. Jenifer and her husband of 35 years live near Dallas. They have 3 grown daughters and 4 grandchildren. Jenifer left her own full-time private practice to co-found H.O.M.E. Jenifer has over a decade of experience providing mental health care, forensic assessments, and expert testimony for U.S. asylum seekers. Her previous practice included 3 years in Honduras, Central America, and her non-clinical experience includes academia and 2 years as a U.S. Senate staffer, where she was assigned to immigration. In 2019, the Human Rights Initiative of Dallas named her their Angel of Freedom recipient for mental health support of their asylum clients. Her recent publication, entitled Perspectives on Asylum Policy, Going to the Borderlands and Coming to Terms with U.S. History, Social Sentiment, and Hope, offers her personal narrative and her explanation of the social implications of asylum policy. Hope for Humanity is grateful to have her tonight, and we welcome her.
Thank you so much, Karen. That was a kind introduction. And I just want to speak first to those of you who are friends of Cindy Andrade Johnson, and I know you wish you could see her tonight. And of course, she's concerned with family issues. If you should also know that she's happy about the events of the day in the Matamoros camp in Brownsville region. If you are her Facebook friend, you may have even seen pictures that she posted from some of those who were able to be there to greet the first migrants coming out of the encampment today. So today was a very eventful day in a good way. But I'm gonna start by explaining, I'm gonna take us back about 10 years, and I wanna tell you how I got into this work. And along the way, I will explain how the encampment developed too. So about 10 years ago, I was living in rural Oklahoma with my husband and the youngest of our 3 daughters. I was homeschooling and an adjunct psychology prof. And as the youngest got close to high school graduation, I told my husband that we were going to have to move afterwards, that there was something else I needed to do, and it was not in rural Oklahoma. And he very generously said, okay. So we moved to Dallas, which is where we've been, where I live still, and where we've been the last 10 years since then. And the work that I do includes trips to the border region regularly. It includes both the Rio Grande Valley, where Matamoros is, as well as the El Paso region. And right now I'm doing most of that remotely, but still working every day in those regions. So when I started though, I was able to, Dallas was the right place because Dallas was we had a high number of refugees and asylum seekers right here. And so I began a clinical practice here where I was offering pro bono services to asylum seekers as part of my private practice. And I learned very quickly that asylum seekers are amazing people. I was, Guy Brewer told, I'm so happy that you mentioned that, yes, they need us, but we need them. And that was the first lesson I learned from the asylum seekers I worked with, that the resilience that they showed was profound and inspired me. So I'll start by explaining that the trauma they fled was unthinkable. And the resilience they showed was not just a response to that trauma, but was their response to life in general and what they wanted to offer in their new land. But the trauma that asylum seekers flee includes And I always worry a little bit about, am I going to be traumatizing someone I'm speaking to? So just let me list a few of the reasons people flee home. And just if you need me to stop, put it in the chat. But asylum seekers often flee their country for torture of various sorts. And torture can take many forms. Some of my clients have been fleeing female genital mutilation. Some of my clients have been fleeing political imprisonment that included torture inside government sanctioned prisons. And some of my clients have been tortured by gangs. And so when it depends somewhat on what part of the world the person is fleeing from. But if we're talking about Central America, then that's generally gang violence. But it's one thing to say gang violence, it's another thing to describe what that means. And so I often would be talking to parents of young children who had been kidnapped, murdered from their schools, from their homes, as a punishment for a parent who didn't give the gangs enough money. And so as the asylum seekers that I was working with were fleeing for their lives, for their children's lives. They had either seen this brutality against someone they knew and loved, or they had been told it was going to happen to them next. They were all aware of it in their community. And so when I learned about the types of suffering that they had endured, and here they are now having been so strong and courageous as to make it somewhere else. And now, as I'm getting to know them in a counseling practice, I recognize the strengths and what they want to offer to our community, but I noticed something else, that they need that trauma therapy is not the same when a person is in the asylum process, because the process itself is traumatizing. Now, I'm starting back years ago, right before the migrant camp. So even those asylum seekers who were already in the US were living under the fear of, I could be deported back to the place where I was tortured. And so I began to think through, what's the bigger picture here? I can offer therapy, I can offer mental health care, and that's important, that's vital. But I'm also going to have to start looking at, how do we address what's happening from those of us who have the right to vote? How do I address what's happening that causes this predicament where asylum seekers are here for years and years before their cases are heard or settled, and they live for years under this fear that they could be sent back. Meanwhile, that situation began to change for the worse. And over time, fewer and fewer asylum seekers were able to make it to Dallas. And that's when I began making trips to the border regions. Excuse me just a sec. So since fewer clients could come and meet me in Dallas, I thought, I gotta go where they are, right? So in my first journeys into the border regions, I noticed there was already a sense of there was already what we call metering. If you're familiar with the immigration terminology, you know what that is. But metering was the decision by the US government to let only a very, very small number of people cross the international bridge at any point on any day. So when I went across the bridge from Brownsville into Matamoros the first time, I was surprised to see 4 people on the bridge who had been there on the Mexico side of the bridge, but already on the bridge, who had been waiting on the bridge for about 4 days. And they were not able to leave the bridge because their turn was next. And if they left, they would lose their turn to interview with Border Patrol. And the only way that they were able to manage this was volunteers like Cindy, volunteers who were able to get food and water to them while they waited. And so I began to talk with them and learned that the reasons that particular group, that was a group that was traveling together, the reasons they had fled their home country was the same that other clients I'd met with in Dallas had left their homes, that people in their neighborhood were being killed. They were frightened. They really had no place they could go that was safe in their home country. And so I walked a little farther on, and I met with people who were just sleeping out on the streets. There were mostly families, mostly parents with young children. I actually met a man that had been in the same neighborhood that I had back when my family and I lived in Honduras. It was a very strange feeling to realize this was someone whose community welcomed me, and now I can't welcome him. And I met a little girl named Margarita. Margarita just came up out of a crowd and took my hand and just smiled up at me. At that point, I'd been carrying a backpack with things like deodorant and toothpaste and soap, and I'd been handing this out to people. And by the time Margarita reached me, I thought the backpack was empty, and I was like, oh, this is the most beautiful little girl. I've got to give her something. And I looked and sure enough, there was a pack of vitamin powder, kind of like a drink mix that was a vitamin enriched drink mix. And I thought, I don't want to just hand this to her, but so I asked her, where's your mom? And so she took my hand and took me over to her mom, and I gave it to her mom and explained what it was. And we had this lovely conversation. And I remembered a song that had Margarita's name in it, and we sang it together. And she just reached up and put her finger on my glasses and just traced around. And it was the most endearing moment. And then I had to leave. And I realized I've got to leave this child here. And she was going to sleep in the park again. She'd been sleeping in the park. In fact, one person in our group asked her, where are you from? And she said, from over there, meaning the park. And the most devastating part for me was that crossing back into the US. And if you haven't been to the Brownsville-Matamoros bridge, and I'd hate to interrupt, but just to say that we have a baby in the household, and I hope everyone enjoys the sound of babies in the background. If you haven't been to the Brownsville-Matamoros bridge and crossed back and forth, it's a quick walk. It's just a few minutes. And it seemed like such a simple thing to do, to cross that bridge and go back to my safe place to stay. But Margarita couldn't come with me. Pedro, the man whose community I had at one time shared, couldn't come with me. None of the people sleeping in the street could, and they were not going to be safe. They were not going to be safe that night. And when I crossed through the port of entry, and I looked off to the right, when you cross that up to the right, you can see there is a glass window, a glass wall actually, where there's an empty room. And that empty room is, there were rows and rows and rows of chairs. There was a restroom, a drinking fountain, and the person next to me, who was local there in Brownsville, said, that's the room where they're supposed to be processing the asylum seekers. And I thought about all the people I'd met that day and realized they could be in that room, but they had been told by our government that they were full. The people we talked to on the bridge as we first went over said, oh yeah, they told us we can't come in right now because they're full. And there was that empty room, and it broke my heart because that's my country not welcoming. So as time went on, I made regular trips into Matamoros, and But the rules, the laws didn't change, the policies changed. The government changed the policies of how they would manage asylum. And if you don't know what MPP stands for, you hear about it a lot. It's a government euphemism for migrant protection protocols, and they were anything but. It was devastating. And what actually happened, it's known also as the Remain in Mexico policy, and that's a little bit more clear in what we're talking about, because this policy meant that asylum seekers, not only would they not just cross those 4 people a day, they weren't crossing anybody. Nobody was allowed to go in. Now, you should know that the US asylum laws were created after World War II as kind of a penitent response on the part of the US for denying many asylum seekers who were Jewish and from countries that were under Nazi rule. And yes, we turned many asylum seekers away during that era. So we created a policy that said that anyone who needed protection from the US government could approach our land. And it wasn't just our ports of entry. The law specifically says anyone can cross at any point, not just at a port of entry, and say, I need asylum. And they have a whole year to make this request because it's a complicated legal process just to put in the petition. And so that's what the law says, and that never changed. But the policy said, oh, no, they can't come in while they're in the process. They have to stay on the Mexico side. So the first time I went back to the camp after this policy was enacted, it went back to Matamoros, I should say, because there was no camp until then. The camp had, it was just devastating. It was not just some families sleeping on the street anymore. It was thousands of people who really had nothing except those benefits that Cindy and others in the Brownsville region would cross every day, bringing donated tents, donated food and supplies. And go ahead and go back a slide, please. And yeah, we can, let me mention this. This is just an example of some of the donations, but I want to mention here, and I don't think you can see them, but there were 10 outhouses for these thousands of people the first time I went. Eventually that got better, and then it got worse again in terms of what was available. So, but yes, the resilience of the people living under those conditions was very powerful. And so, but before I get to resilience, there's one story I need to tell you that was kind of a turning point for me in recognizing just how bad the conditions were at the camp. I climbed up a levee not too far from what you're seeing here. I climbed up and was looking down across the tents. And I had some mental health information. I had worked with a local psychologist or a counselor rather, and created a flyer of ways that people could care for their own mental health while they're in the camp, because what else could we do, right? So I was distributing those and just having conversations with people, not counseling sessions. But I climbed up and I saw a woman there who was, she just kind of looked, she had a vacant look on her face. And I went over and sat with her, and she had a campfire going, and there was smoke from her campfire, and she just kind of sat there, and it just, she didn't even flinch. So I thought, okay, I can handle the smoke too. And finally she said, I sent my daughter across yesterday. And I had to stop, kind of catch my breath, because I knew what that meant. I asked, how old was your daughter? Well, she was 9. I couldn't let her suffer anymore. It's too dangerous here in the camp. And she was raped here. And so was I. And I couldn't let her stay here any longer. But we can't go back to our home country because the gangs killed my parents and they're trying to kill me. And there was nothing I could say. There was nothing I could do for her. No way to make that better. And the biggest challenge was that this was a very common story. And it's not just, isn't just the Matamoros camp, it's still, it's all along the southern border where there are communities of migrants who are trapped due to MPP. Even though MPP is lifted and it's begun to be lifted today, they crossed 30 of the thousands, right? So it's a very slow process and a very dangerous condition. Other places I've been, there were mothers who asked for birth control for their preteen daughters because that was the only way, because they expected them to be raped. People are often kidnapped, extortion, so they're kidnapped and asked for them to contact any family members they have in the US to send money to the gang so that the kidnappers will let people loose. So as I said, it's always a little bit challenging to know. I don't want to traumatize anybody, but I think it's really important for those of us who are in places of safety to recognize what's going on and to recognize that the violence that people are trying to escape is real, and this is happening in their home countries as well as along the southern border. So, okay, next slide, please. I also want you to know how strong and how resourceful and how caring these communities are. So with the donated stuffed toys, this mother created just a lovely environment for her child. And I'll tell you, and this mother gave me permission to share the pictures from the inside of her tent. But she invited the neighborhood children over to watch movies on her cell phone. She figured out ways to make that community as healthy and loving and kind as she possibly could for not just her children, but all the children around. And these are, that's the nature of the resilient people. Imagine that to be in this camp, a family had to have had a lot of courage and to survive on the goodness of the goodness of heart of people like Cindy and those who are making donations for 2 years. That's takes somebody with a lot of strength and courage, and that's the kind of person I want to have as my next door neighbor. And that's why we need the asylum seekers too. We need what they have to teach us and offer us and do for us and build our communities. Yeah, what we need from them is important, but in the meantime, there is still some that they need from us, and they need, for one, kinder policies, and that's beginning to happen today. But it's a very, very small beginning, and it's not just this end of MPP, but it's the changing of an entire system to be a welcoming nation. And so I'll tell you what, I want to show you just a little bit about what I'm doing now. So next slide. In addition to the counseling, and really more of my focus now than the counseling, is mental health assessment. And the reason for a mental health assessment to be important for an asylum seeker is that when they approach the southern border, or wherever they come in, some asylum seekers actually have come in on a student visa, for example, and then realized that home was too dangerous to return to. So wherever they come to and they petition for asylum, they have to show that there's something traumatic and dangerous and risky in their home country. And most of the time, especially those along the southern border, most of the time they don't have any way to, they don't have evidence of that. Why would they have pictures? Why would they have documentary evidence of what the gangs were doing in their community? That's very difficult to prove. And So what a mental health professional can do is to listen to their story, to document it, or to hear it in the same way that we would someone else who is reporting a trauma experience. And we can document whether their telling of it is something that is consistent with what you would expect from someone who actually had that experience. And then we can document the level of effect that their experiences in their home country have had on their mental health over time, as well as the resilience and the ways in which we see the resilience. And we can document the effects of camp itself on mental health and explain the importance of being able to cross right away and not having to wait for that crossing. So it seemed to me, after having spent many years of doing the counseling, that this was a missing piece for me. And so I began to develop the assessment piece of my work, and I wanted to grow that beyond what I could do by myself. So I have been able to build a collaboration of mental health professionals actually across the US who are able to work with asylum seekers in the states where they are licensed, or to do remote telehealth work into the camp itself. And so that has been our way of contributing, and that is where we are now. I think I'll stop and see what questions or comments people have.
Wow, Jenifer, what an awesome amount of information and just very powerful witness you have. We really appreciate it. Folks, please post in the chat any questions you might have. There is one question. Arizona, our national J Fund asked, how are you funded?
Actually, at the moment, we're not. So
I can relate.
No, this is something that I just can't not do, right? So we are still, we just submitted grants for it. We've only been incorporated since October. And even though I've been doing this work a long time and the people I collaborated with had been, the organization itself is new. So we do have some private individual funding. And so I shouldn't say we're not funded at all, but it's very, very small. And that's one of the things I do hope to grow, because I think once we have some funding, then we can bring more people into work more regularly. But I have been pleased to see that volunteer mental health professionals are very passionate about this work. And it's not been as hard as I thought it might be to make phone calls to people in different states when asylum cases come up in other states, because we have to work in states where we're licensed, right? So I've been really excited to see the level of compassion amongst mental health professionals too.
So it sounds like you work in more states than just Texas.
Yes, that's true, because sometimes when a person is detained by ICE, they can be moved around. Mm-hmm. Or as what we hope a better scenario is, for example, the 30 people who were able to cross out of the camp today, I have no idea where they're going, but as that begins to happen and increase, they will go all across the nation, right? So they will go wherever they have a relative or friend who sponsors them, and then their asylum cases will be in a location near them.
So the information that they need to prove that they, that they are eligible for asylum, they need after they cross the border, not as they're crossing the border.
It's both. So they start, and if you have any immigration attorneys here, they can say more about that than I can. But what they start with is a credible fear interview with the USCIS. Hopefully, sometimes Border Patrol has been doing it. But that first interview is hopefully with someone who has a little bit of training in and hopefully somewhat trauma informed, but that doesn't always work that way. But they need to be able to at least have that person believe that their story is real and that it seems credible to the person who hears them first. And that's when they can be allowed, when MPP is not happening, right, they can be allowed in for the rest of the asylum process. But that's just the beginning. So the asylum process can take years. Don't know what that's going to look like in the future, but even before the current era, when I first came to Dallas, the cases were taking 2 to 3 years. And at that point, a lot of my clients did not have work permission for most of that time. It was really difficult for them to survive that, even though they were in a safe community in Dallas, they didn't have means of support because they were not allowed to work. So that eventually got a little better where they do usually get some work permission, but it's not right away. And it can take, if there's an attorney here, I want to say 180 days. So, and the clock stops and starts and you never really know. So the asylum process itself is tough, but as they go through, they'll have multiple hearings, and for their final hearing, then they do have to have more evidence, and they have to convince an immigration judge that what they're saying happened to them in their country really happened, and that their fear of return is real. And and it has to be based on particular things, right? So it's not just anybody. If they come from a country that's at war, that's not enough. They have to be targeted because of their religion or their politics or their ethnicity, race, or because they're what we call a member of a particular social group, which can be interpreted different ways. But it can't just be. So some cases won't be accepted because they can't show that it is connected to that type of persecution. And it also has to be persecution that comes either from the government or from a group that the government wouldn't control or didn't control. So there are a lot of pieces that have to fall into place, and they have to be believed.
Yeah.
And so that's where one of the things we try to do is just in our documentation, just explain to the judge how trauma memory works, right? Because it's easy for a person to not remember details that don't really stay in your head when your life is under instant threat. And the judge might ask, well, how far away were you standing from that person? Or how many people were in the room? Or what date was that? And a trauma survivor is not going to remember those things. But a judge might say, well, if you don't remember it, then I don't believe your story. And so we always try to document just how trauma memory works in every case that we write, so that the judge can at least have, the attorney can fall back on that and say, well, we wouldn't expect him to remember this. We wouldn't expect her to remember that because look what the documentation says. That's not how trauma memory works. So all of those pieces are something we try to contribute to.
So we have a question, how do they prove trauma? It sounds like they answer questions, but how else?
Yeah, that's a great question. And prove is not the right word. It's evidence, right? So and all that we do on the mental health side is evidence based on a mental health interview. And that's our only expertise. So that's all we do. The attorney can bring in a country conditions expert that would give evidence for what's happening in that place. An attorney can bring in hopefully some documentation of that person's particular circumstances. There may be some written documents, there may be newspaper articles, but that's all on the attorney's side. The parts that we contribute to is giving evidence that the trauma itself was real and the person is suffering from the same, tells the event and reports current mental health status. That would be what I would expect from somebody who had been through that type of situation.
I know before this, we started, you were saying that you've been getting a lot of texts from the border. Do you have any idea about how many people were able to cross today?
You know what? As you said that, I smiled and looked down because my phone keeps flashing purple and white, which is the color that comes up when it's them. I have to read, but I know this morning that we anticipated 25, and I was on the call with them this morning when the people in the camp said that was way more than 25 people they put in the van. They had 2 vans, and
Oh, wow.
so 2 large vans. So it was more than
Awesome.
25 people who crossed. And we were excited that,
Awesome.
that it started already, that we weren't sure on the day that it was today.
Yeah. Super. Awesome. Well,
Yes.
thank you so much. And we do have another question, and just to let everyone know that after the prayer, the chat room's going to be open, or the chat is going to be open. So if you want to ask questions, Jenifer, I don't know if you can stick around and answer some questions in the chat if there are any. If not, that's fine. But
Sure.
I know you've had a long day today.
I'll stay.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jenifer, for your servant's heart, your passionate witness, and for helping us all to bear witness to the unjust systems that cause so much harm and trauma to our migrant siblings. You've informed and inspired us all. It all feels so overwhelming. We're angry and sad, and we want to help in some way, but what can we do? Hope for Humanity is aware that finding a solution to the suffering of migrants and refugees seems overwhelming. Hope for Humanity is a mission of hope, and we would like to help you shrink the task of changing these unjust systems a bit. Historic and well-established systems of injustice are rarely changed overnight, but usually through the effort of many, many persistent, passionate advocates taking small steps over time. Hope for Humanity had the privilege of advocating with our senators and representatives in Washington, D.C. in 2019. We learned a valuable lesson there, that our elected officials listen and they want to hear us. Our system of representation actually works. So we urge you to contact your elected officials regularly, and we have resources that will help you do just that. Here are just a few suggestions of small steps you can take. Donate to groups, persons, and organizations that advocate for migrants and refugees. Share your contact information with us for updates and access to additional resources, and there'll be a link in the chat. Participate in our future online gatherings and in-person pilgrimages, and use the resources on our website and Facebook page to learn more, starting with this invitation to our March 25th gathering with our guest, Mike Seifert from the ACLU, Texas. Also, pray unceasingly and sermonize. Thank you, friends, for your solidarity with oppressed persons and for your passion to change unjust systems. Thank you for joining us today. After the closing prayer, the slides will be taken down and the chat will be open for about 10 minutes. To all, if you would like to chat with one another or ask questions, please scroll through the gallery view to see everyone. We'll close now with the Immigrant Prayer.
Well, I don't know about you, but my heart is really full from all that we've learned tonight. Many thanks to all those who have shared. And now I have the privilege of voicing the Immigrants' Prayer that we might offer together. Almighty and merciful God, whose Son became a refugee and had no place to call his own, look with mercy on those who today are fleeing from danger, homeless and hungry. Bless those who work to bring them relief. Inspire generosity and compassion in all our hearts. and guide the nations of the world towards that day when all will rejoice in your commonwealth of justice and of peace. Amen.
So Jenifer, there was a question about what happens to children when they cross alone.
Oh, great question. Yeah. So I'm honestly not sure now that since the rules have just changed, and I just got a message that my internet is unstable. So I'm gonna, if I disappear, that's what. But the way that it usually works is that the child goes into the custody of the federal government, and there were tent camps for a while. Usually that's it is controlled by the Office of Refugee and Resettlement, and I'm not really sure now what locations they're going to, but there have been child detention centers across the country. And then the hope is to be released to a relative. Usually there is a relative in the US. But they have to be cleared by the federal government, and that generally from the mental health professionals I've talked to have been part of that process, and I haven't, but they say that it takes much longer than it should. And again, that's probably changed since I last had that conversation, but yeah, the child will be held in custody for quite some time, several weeks maybe, or months.
And there was a question about their mental health. Do they receive any mental health help at all? Was that your question, Robin? Yeah. Do you get any mental health services at all when they're in detention?
Yes. I've heard different reports on that. So when I've gone into detention centers to do assessments, I can ask about that. That was pre-COVID. And I could actually walk in and ask a client, what kind of care are you getting? And some were not getting any at all. That was more common. Or they were getting a few minutes at a time, once a month maybe. But some said, I don't have enough time with my counselor, but I have a counselor and I like her. Counselors that I've talked to who have been in that situation have really struggled, though, because they struggle with whether their records are private, and how much leeway they have. But yes, there is some semblance of mental health care, but not what it needs to be.
Are there any other questions? Okay, well, I think that you can go to your family, Jenifer. Thank you so much for joining us, and good night, everyone.
Thank you for inviting me. Good night.